So without further ado, just a reminder that the resources are in the chat. Please put your questions there. And Dr. J, please take it away.
Why, thank you, Jessica. I'm not exactly sure who that person was she was introducing, but you're getting me today. You ever stop to think about, man, all the things I've ever done? Quite exciting. I'm really grateful to be here with you all today. The California Labor Management Initiative, besides from the Teacher Residency Lab, is one of my all-time favorite initiatives that the Foundation does. And it's because, as you know, when you're an educator, it is so important that our teachers and our leaders are on the same page, because that's what makes it, that's what makes the school experience better for everyone. And when I was an administrator, there wasn't the Labor Management Initiative, and I think back and gosh, I wish that was around when I was doing that. But I'm so excited to be able to support this. And I'm going to ask Jessica if you can we mute the bells? I don't know how to do that, but
yeah, I will try to do that. I thought putting myself on mute would work, but it looks like that's not the case. I'll work on that in the meantime.
Okay, thank you. So before we get started, I actually wanted to show a video of Patrick Dolan, talking about unions, because I think it's going to be important to ground us. So just 1 second here, I'm going to play something that he's shared.
This thing called a teachers union is in some senses comes, if you will, after the fact. After the fact, but always has been part of the puzzle. And those are the aspects of the fact that this work also has to do, particularly in a democracy, all right? It has always had to do with social justice. And it means, what that means is that one should not be surprised if this union not only represents its own people, its own adults with respect to its practice and so forth, but that it keeps a particular kind of protective role and voice around the work with poor children, children in some senses who come with deep disadvantages, special education, by race, by economic background, and so forth. This profession always has been, in some senses, also an advocate for this. Not universally, right? Not in every community, but in general, at the core of its founding, right? And I alluded to where it started.
So I shared that with you because that's so much about what I love about education and teaching in general, is that at the core of our founding, at the core of who we are, this is about students, what's best for students. And with everything that's been happening, right, with COVID and the recent, although I think it's been there a while, but the civil unrest, I think it's time to make sure and think about what it is that we are doing and why it is that we are in this profession in the first place. And it's to make sure that our students, our educators, are getting what they need, and that we care and we look out for the best interests and needs of everyone. Now, just like Dr. Dolan said, we may not always get it right. And especially right now with compassion fatigue, which is what my research is all about, which is essentially this idea where you kind of get tired of caring, or tired from caring. You care, but you're so exhausted that it takes its toll on you. It's really that much more important to remember as a labor management team that at the core, our work is rooted in social justice. Okay? Now, as we move on, you saw my title of this presentation, and part of that I wanted to talk just briefly about what compassion is. Now, I've already mentioned that compassion fatigue is that physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion that comes with working with people who are in constant states of distress or trauma. And what COVID-19 has done, and all of the issues around race in our country and actually around the world, what it's done is it exacerbated all of the stress we may have already been feeling, right? Before COVID, we had students who were going through all kinds of things, and that was already taking its toll on educators. But now with the new, now with everything else that's going on, it kind of adds a layer of additional stress and additional trauma. And so right now, compassion, especially self-compassion, is needed. Now, here are just a few thoughts from Brene Brown. There are lots of people who talk about compassion, but I think this one is important. Her book is called, this is from the book, The Gifts of Imperfection. But when we talk about compassion, what she's saying is she feels like it's when you're feeling completely exposed and completely loved and accepted at the same time, right? Think about that, where you are confronting, right, all the things that, well, to be quite honest, aren't pretty, right? They're not pleasant. Like if I'm going to have compassion for someone, I need to be able to put myself in their shoes, right? And what COVID is doing is giving everybody an opportunity to understand what it means to suffer. In the past, I don't think that we've always had that lens, especially when it comes to students who may have, who are poor, or students who are living in poverty. Maybe you don't understand, we wouldn't understand what that meant. Or maybe we didn't understand what it meant when people would talk about Black Lives Matter, for example, why that whole movement came about and why there was so much angst against policing and why people were trying to speak out. But now, in the situation that we are in, I think it's giving everybody a chance to actually get it and understand what people are going through. But when you get to a point where you can get it and you can look at it and you're not running away from all the pain or the shame that might come up, or the guilt, or even the anger, you're just sitting with it, that's when compassion happens, when you can see it and then take action, right? And you're doing it not from a place of judgment, but from a place of, it's a place of knowing. And the thing about compassion, I think that what everybody forgets is that compassion isn't just about, oh, I love you, and it's not about pity, it's not that kind of thing. It's I see you and I can help. If I can, I'm gonna do my best to help, right? But part of that includes accountability, right? Holding ourselves accountable for actions. I'm going to give an example that's kind of benign. It's not necessarily related to education, but I kind of think it makes this more easy to understand. Think about potty training, right? Maybe a child or a pet, right? We love our pets, we love our children, but we are absolutely adamant that when you are going to the restroom, you go here. It's just the way it is. That is the boundary, right? It makes it better for them at that moment and also as they grow up, right? So you can still be loving, you can still be kind, but you can also have a boundary that you've set and that we need to adhere to, right? And that's kind of what I want us to think about when we're tackling this work, right? It's hard, right? A lot of the difficulty with compassion or even moving forward with this work is because it comes from shame, right? Or maybe guilt or anger or blame, or maybe we've been, thinking about, gosh, if I think about education all these years and I think about the achievement gap, right? That Dr. Noguera was talking about. And if I really think about how many times, especially during this COVID pandemic, all of our students who may have disabilities or students of color or students who may not be, students who have lower socioeconomic statuses have been failed by our system, it makes me sad. And it's hard, and I don't want to look at that. But we need to, right? We have to look at that. And we're going to look through this with compassion. And that's because what's happening with our nation, it's important, right? We have some decisions to make. And we need to make sure that the decisions we make and the resulting changes that come from it are going to benefit everyone. It's going to make it better for everyone. This right here is an image. I actually picked this up at the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. And this kind of grounded me. It reminded me of why we do this work and why it's so important. What it says at the bottom is, even in the midst of our worst struggle, our forefathers knew that part of our advancement and growth began with a sound education, right? Education is so important. It's the thing that every single person in the country goes through. And teachers and educators, you're important because you work with every single child. In California alone, that's about 6.2 million kids. But the thing is, and I think this is actually, if you've seen me before, if you know anything about my research, I believe in focusing on our own locus of control. And the thing that has the most impact, was the most direct influence on our kids, are teachers. And I'm adamant that we need to make sure that whatever we're doing, as we move forward with compassion, it's going to support our teachers. Because that is when we have teachers who can then turn around and support the whole child. What I'm saying is we need whole teacher support, because when we do that, we can support the whole child. Now, I know my research was only focused on teachers, right? And it did that just, at a practical level, trying to finish the work. But this, you can put whole educator support, right? We have the whole child. Let's think about the whole teacher. As I said earlier, the COVID-19, our situation with this, the race issues, all of that is already exacerbating every kind of feeling you may have had from working with students who are experiencing trauma, right? And you also have your own lives, right? And so when you think about that, think about how vital you are to our profession, and the fact that I am certain every parent in our country now knows how important teachers are, how important educators are. When you think about that, why wouldn't we make changes or make moves to make sure that we're supporting our teachers? I just want to summarize briefly, though, what I'm talking about in terms of what people are dealing with. This is from Sean Ginwright. He was talking about what happens with racial trauma or in trauma in general. And what he says is, the hardships of poverty, racism, lack of employment opportunities, and neighborhood decay over time wear away at both our mental and our physical health. Environmental stressors from exposure to violence, lack of economic resources, and discrimination disproportionately injure the well-being of people who live and people who work in low-income neighborhoods. Over time, this chronic stress can also erode hope, sense of agency, and the ability to see a brighter future. So, can you just sit with that for a minute? Sit with the fact that it's time that we definitely acknowledge that the trauma and what we're seeing has an issue. I know that quote that I just read, you're not going to necessarily be able to see it. This is just something I'm sharing with you. I can send it if you'd like it. But what I'm suggesting here is that if we acknowledge the toll that this is taking on our kids, we also then must acknowledge the toll it's taking on our educators. And we have to do something about it. And so for today, I'm going to be sharing with you 2 very powerful tools that a labor management team can use to think about how they're going to support the whole teacher from a compassionate lens, and how they might then be able to use that to then support all students and all educators in general. So before I kind of delve more deeply into that, Jessica, I cannot see the chat, so I don't know if there are any questions that have popped up, but if there are, just feel free to let me know.
Sure. Thus far, we haven't seen any questions pop up, but I will absolutely let you know, and then I invite people to add them whenever they come to mind.
Okay, thanks. So, all right, so if we're starting to look then through a compassionate lens, which we know can be difficult, which we know means acknowledging pain, acknowledging suffering, acknowledging wrongdoing, but doing it from a place where it's like, okay, I see it, I get it, and now I can act to make changes and to make it better. But that'll also include accountability. If we start to look at it that way, then let's talk about what it is you might be able to do in your situations as you're thinking about reopening school to support your educators so that things will get better. What you have here on the screen is an image of something called an educator-focused multi-tiered system of support. So we have MTSS, right? But really that's kind of focused on our students. What I'm proposing that you do, right, is you look at that type of organization framework, which is really what MTSS is. It's just an organization framework that helps you think about how you might go about offering support to all the different stakeholders in your system, right? When we look at MTSS for students, it's all, some, and few, and how it works for all of our students, what we're going to do for some of our students, and what we're going to do for a few of our students. Let's think about this from the educator perspective. What are you going to do for all teachers? And you can change that if you want to put in all educators, right? It includes everyone, some educators, and few educators. When I'm talking about all, I'm talking about everybody who's already been working and they're already part of the profession, and anyone who's entering the profession. When I'm talking about some, I'm talking in particular those who are working at urban school sites. Let's just think about this. In our districts and throughout the state, there are some schools that have higher instances or higher, more amounts of students of color, or more amounts of students with higher socioeconomic status or lower, so lots of children in poverty. And there might be some schools that have more students who have special needs. Depending on what that situation is, that school or those people working at those schools may need more support than others, right? And then we have the few. I always thought about this in terms of schools that might be in extreme crisis, right? Very extreme. So I was thinking about schools that just pertain to, like, maybe at a county office where they have medically fragile students, for example. What are you going to do there? Maybe it's not possible to have a hybrid situation. What would you offer there? Or maybe you have a situation where you have a school where a lot of the students or educators may have experienced death, lots of death due to COVID-19. Or maybe there's a situation where there's high suicide rates, suicide clusters, or whatever that might be, even school shootings, whatever the extreme crisis is, those schools might even need more specific support than others. And so if we were to think about this from a compassionate lens, what could that potentially look like? So for Tier 1, Dr. Noguera was talking about this instance where it is very likely that all of our students have seen the George Floyd video, although I wouldn't recommend it. It's hard for me to watch, so I imagine it's very difficult for kids to watch. But you could be in a situation where the students are coming back and they want to be able to talk about this and talk through their feelings. Or maybe they want to talk about COVID-19 and maybe that a family member passed away and they weren't able to see them in the hospital because they were so sick. These are going to be situations. I've personally known people who have passed, personally known family members who have been really sick and I can't go see them. It's difficult for me. So if that's happening for our students, how then do we talk about that, right? So I'm recommending that for all teachers, when I think about this, at the very least, we need to have some discussions around racial trauma, right? And what that might look like. We might need to start talking more about culturally sensitive pedagogy and start upping the ante on what it is that we're offering, right? Maybe we need to talk about secondary trauma and stress. Secondary trauma is trauma that you experience secondhand. Anybody who watched the George Floyd video experienced some secondary trauma. You weren't the one who was being impacted necessarily firsthand, but you felt it and you know what that was like. And that is secondary trauma, and it causes stress. Just as much stress as experiencing trauma can in the first place, just if you were experiencing it firsthand. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what that looks like. What are some of the symptoms? And I'll give you a few just in case you may have been feeling these. Irritability. Maybe you are being social distancing, not being able to go anywhere. Maybe you're snapping at people, taking people's heads off more than usual, right? Maybe you are feeling anxious, anxiety, and you can't figure out why. Maybe you're having trouble sleeping, right? Imagine having all of those things and then trying to get up and go to work, or you're dealing with your classroom of kids, and maybe you have your own kids themselves, I'm telling you is that people are going to be coming back with a lot on their plate. So why not take the time to think about now, okay, how do we address that now and how can we offer support? Mental health first aid training should be a must, absolute must, right? Right now, we need to be able to recognize the signs of someone who is in distress with mental health and know what to do, right? Actually, next week, and I'm really excited about it, at the lab, we're offering a session on trauma-sensitive mindfulness, right? Trauma-sensitive mindfulness. Think about this. If part of your plan is to focus on social-emotional learning needs, which you absolutely should, you might have to be mindful that sometimes in doing that, it can be triggering. So suppose you're doing a mini 1-minute meditation with your class before your class starts, right? And everyone's breathing and they're taking a few deep breaths, and a student has a flashback, right? Maybe they have a flashback. Maybe you have a flashback and it triggers something for you. How would you handle that as an educator? How would you expect your educators to handle that? Do you know what you would do, right? Do they know what they would do? So when we're thinking about tier 1, all teachers, the trick is to step back and say, okay, well, what things would I be offering to everyone? Make sure at the very least, at the basic level, these things are covered so that we know what to do here, right? A check mark with the ellipses is just thoughts for anything else that you think everyone should understand and know, right? For some teachers, I would think that, not that self-care isn't for everyone. I just think that in certain situations, it's going to be more and more important that we focus that. Mindfulness would be helpful, trauma-sensitive mindfulness, exercise, nutrition, all of those things. And then when we're in crisis, extreme crisis, and maybe someone is, this is what I love about educators. We care so much, but we also feel really guilty when we can't do what we need to do. And we beat ourselves up a lot, right? Feel bad about that. I want to make sure that everyone is practicing self-compassion. Give yourselves the grace that you might give someone else who's going through a lot of hardship. I also want to, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have a question that kind of speaks to these tiers. So I was wondering if I could ask you here before you move on to another section. Is that okay?
Sure.
So Leahy asks about how do we consider the differential needs of teachers within the same schools? That not all teachers in schools with extreme crisis will need the same levels of support. It's sort of maybe EMTSS within EMTSS. So I was wondering if you could touch on that. And then I'm sure we have other great questions for later, but given the timing of this slide, I thought I'd ask now.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And you're right. I think though, part of this is depending on what's in the contract, the bargaining contract, you're not going to necessarily force everybody to engage in everything, right? But if at that school site, you already are aware that this could be a possibility, you're offering it. Doesn't mean that everybody will take you up on it, but at least you're offering it. And that's how I think about differentiation. Like, for example, the seeking mental health support, or not everybody's going to necessarily need to do that, but maybe there's something on campus that you're offering that's available to people. Or maybe it'll be in a hybrid situation. I think about when we have, for example, when we have a huge disaster on campus or something, you have mental health providers on campus, right? It's an optional thing. Maybe people won't necessarily take you up on it, but sometimes people will. And that's how I would differentiate. That's why I think you should think about 2 frames, right? You have your frame of what you want to do for everyone, no matter what, right? For some and few, but then when you're at the school site, you also need to think about, well, maybe all people would partake, maybe some people would partake, maybe only a few people partake, but it doesn't mean that we're not offering it. So that's kind of what I would think about. We're going to actually delve in a little bit more deeply with a few tools around how to do these things. And so if you'd like, we have a couple of options. I'm going to ask Jessica or Ashley to pop that link again into the chat, which is where the resources are. Or you can take out your phone and turn on your camera and aim your camera at that QR code in the slide. and it should pop open a drive. And when you do, that drive will have these presentation slides, and I'll also have the 2 tools that we're going to be talking about. Okay. So I'll just pause about 30 more seconds before I pop over to the next slide. Okay. All right. So how could you utilize EMTSS in your own institutions as a labor management team? Okay, the first tool is this. It's a blank type of form, but what it is, it has 3 guiding questions, right? So as a team, what is something that you want to do for everyone? What are the things that you are absolutely planning on doing for all of your educators? Whether it's as a labor management team, whether it's just labor, whether it's just management, no matter what it is it that everyone needs to do? I'm going to say this again, I'm going to recommend it if it hasn't already happened. Mental health first aid training, right? That should be a part of the list no matter what, right? But then as you talk about this, as you are talking about what the all would be, then you are then just listing what those could look like, right? In tier 2, the guiding question here is, what do you want to do for some educators? Now remember, I said urban school sites, right? I'm talking about schools that are going to have students that have more needs. When you have students who have more needs or who might need additional support, your teachers will then also need more additional support. When I was doing the research on compassion fatigue, what I found was that teachers working at high poverty schools experience higher compassion fatigue, higher burnout, and higher secondary traumatic stress than teachers who are not working at high poverty schools. It was also more acute with female teachers, especially at the middle school level. What's interesting about this is that over 60% of California student population qualifies for free and reduced price lunch. So we have a majority of our students in the state who are experiencing poverty, and 73% of our teaching population is female, right? So we have more teachers who are female. What that saying is that we have a lot of people who will fall into this situation, who will be needing additional support. So let's just talk about what we can do now. And then for tier 3, let's think about the few teachers. What's going on in your space? This is kind of one of those questions around, well, what do you want to do for those who are in extreme crisis? It's going to require you to know, well, what's happening in our schools? Like what are the different situations? What are our students experiencing? What are our educators experiencing? Like for me, I keep thinking about people who have health issues, who have maybe in medically sensitive issues. You might have educators who aren't going to be able to come to the campus to do hybrid. So how are you going to support them, right? And like I said, you might have educators who could be experiencing some pretty harrowing circumstances. So it's important that we at least talk about it and think through this. And I want to remind us to kind of just make sure that we're doing this with a compassionate lens, that we're having grace as we do it, because it could be a difficult conversation. It could be very difficult. And so just know that it's okay to feel your feelings, but as you do, it's okay. Just breathe and work through it. It will be okay, but it could be difficult. Okay, so these guiding questions are here for you. This frame is, this document is in the resources. The next tool, and this one I recommend looking at the actual document and the resources that I gave you. It's hard to see otherwise, but I'm going to try and walk us through it just briefly. This is meant to help everyone in your organization understand your current reality. Like, what is it we're working with? What's the real, right? And it also helps you to kind of think about what you want your desired future reality to look like. It's going to help you distinguish between the gaps between the two, and then any actions that you need to take to close those gaps. So it's ideal in translating the ideal vision that you want into something that can be practical and real, right? So the idea would be to create a real and meaningful vision to address educators' compassion fatigue and to realize the promise of educational equity. So the way that you do this is you start on the bottom left. Okay, let me see, the bottom left where the star is, where it says start here. The way that you do it as a team, okay, you start thinking about, okay, well, what's happening right now? What are some specific events that characterize our current reality? So what are the instances where educators might be experiencing trauma, or students? And then what are some instances where policies have led to biased behavior toward educators and our students? I'm just going to use a simple example that'll kind of help us think through this. For example, there was a policy in my district where students had to be dressed up when they were promoting. They had to be wearing a tie. Girls had to have on, specific length dress. They couldn't have spaghetti straps. And it was interesting because there were quite a few students who couldn't afford those things, right? And if they weren't able to afford it, if they didn't have on the right attire, they wouldn't be able to participate in the ceremony. That's a policy that's biased, right? And then as you move up, you look for patterns or behaviors or trends. Are there specific events that indicate a pattern over time? Has this happened more than once? Is it happening repeatedly? Do you have examples? Or poll your team. Does everyone in your labor management team have an example around how this particular instance or problem has shown up in their particular site, right? And then as you move forward, you continue to look and say, well, are there structures? Are there things that exist in our district or how we govern that are actually perpetuating this, right? Is it visible in a board policy? Is it visible in our discipline policy or what we're giving parents? Is it part of our contract? Is it part of our evaluations? Where else is it showing up? And then as you do that, okay, this part, the next part becomes a little tricky, right? A mental model is how we think, how we believe or think about the world, or what we believe about how things are working. So maybe that example I gave was about, the mental model could be that you have to look a certain way in order to celebrate graduations or promotions, right? It sounds kind of weird as I say it, but sometimes it's there. And so you want to be able to tackle that. And then as you move up, the last piece is, what is the current vision in use? What I'm saying here is that we might have something on paper, but that's not the real, right? You can start with what's really on paper, but in reality, this is what's happening. This whole column around current reality is about getting to the real, and it's going to require a lot of compassion and a lot of self-compassion, because some of it may be difficult to look at, right? But we have to. And then as we sit and work through it, what you want to do is when you get to the top and you're at the vision, you move to the right and you go to the future reality, and you start at the very top and you start to talk about, okay, knowing that all of this exists, what is it that we really want to happen? What would it look like if we were doing things that were supporting all of our educators? So that was focused on whole teacher support. What would it look like if we were getting rid of policies that kind of are biased or perpetuating inequities? What is that? And you start to talk about that. What is it that you want? And then you move down, like what set of assumptions will help you realize this vision. One assumption that or belief that I think helps is this notion that it's okay to give those who need more support, right? So that might mean putting a little bit more financial resources in a particular area, right? But it will be okay to do that because we know we need to, right? So just something like that. And then as you move down, you have a set of questions, right? And then you get to the part where it says stop here. By the time you are done, you will have had a beautiful conversation around what it actually looks like, where we want to go, what are some steps that we can take to actually get there. And the tool in the drive gives you this image that you see on the screen, so it gives you guiding questions, but then it also gives you a blank template. And I feel like if you use this one, and I'm going to go back, combined with this, what you will end up with is something that looks like this for your situation, so that everybody knows, all right, this is what we're going to do for everyone. This is what we're going to do for some people. This is what we're going to do for a few. But what that does is it gives you a plan that is compassionate, that is focused and direct, and that will help us move forward as we open schools. Okay. Jessica, I'm sure you'll interrupt me if there are any questions.
There are some great questions. Would you like to turn to those for a few questions right now?
Yeah, great. You know what? Give me one. Hold on. Give me 2 minutes. Let me finish. I'm pretty much done here, and then I'll answer any questions.
Nope.
So I just want to. This is my. This whole presentation is actually based on a new article that's coming out, and it's part of that I wrote, and it's part of the CDE's Foundation's efforts to make sure that we are also providing additional support around equity and compassion. I have to add that in. But what I'm going to ask everybody to do is to practice self-compassion. Love yourself, be kind to yourself, extend the grace you would afford anyone else going through tremendous turmoil to yourself. You are worth it. You matter today, tomorrow, and always. I get all teary-eyed thinking about that, but you do. I know personally, without educators, without my teachers, without the administrators, I wouldn't be where I am today. And I love, love, love you all so much. But I want to make sure that you know that whatever you're going through right now, it's okay. It's hard, I know, but just make sure that you know you're worth it, right? And if you think your students are worth it, know that you are too, okay? And then I just wanted to, if you want, you can take a picture of this slide. Here are some additional resources as well that you might want to dig into. So the recommendations on the EMTSS, there's more research, more in-depth research here. And you can look that up here with the research link. The EMTSS has a whole host of the policy brief that has a ton of recommendations for tier 1, 2, and 3, right? So if you need a place to start and you want ideas, take a look at that, and it could be some information that will help seed your thinking as a labor management team. The other one is just it's a TED Talk, but it's talking about the fact that we are suffering and that it impacts all of us, and that our teachers, honestly, I feel like we're first responders. Educators are first responders, and we need to be revered as such. I mean, although the pandemic has been pretty, this whole situation has been pretty stressful, one thing that I think is good that's come out of it is people realizing how important we are, how vital we are to how our system and how our world works. And so that I appreciate. And then I'm going to ask you, if you want, you can take a picture of this slide as well. If you want to talk, if you want to connect, feel free to just give me a call. I think, Jessica, will you type my email address in the chat? Because I think
yes, I just noticed that. Yeah. You can also reach Jacqueline through the platform that all the summit is on. If you click on speakers and message her directly, but I'm also going to add that in here.
And so while she's doing that, actually I can do it. While I'm doing that, will you go ahead and ask some of those questions?
Yes. So we have some really sort of great groupings of questions. One aspect of them speaks to the mental models that you mentioned before, both about people and the way they look at the necessity or even just the existence of compassion for themselves. So how do you help people see that that's an important part of this? And then also, how do you get the administration to understand and support compassion for teachers? and to promote equity-driven professional learning. So I'll pause there. There's some other follow-up questions, but let's start with those.
So I was thinking the last piece was getting administration to support it, but the other piece was what? Back again about how we have compassion for ourselves.
It was about helping people realize that that's important to do for themselves as well. Perhaps not everyone does. And the person who asked that question, I'm trying to take a look up there. I think it was Stephanie. If you have any clarifying points you want to add in the chat to help us ask that better, please go ahead and do so.
Well, what I would say is that part of what's happening right now is I do think that people are focused on, well, we need to reopen, right? We definitely need to reopen. We got to get ourselves back on track. As you're thinking about what's going to be needed when you reopen, part of that is got to be an understanding of, well, first of all, administrators know it doesn't matter, what you want to do. You're not going to do this without your teachers, right? And so it's very important that our teachers have what they need in order to be to successfully carry this out, in order to be able to support our students effectively. And so part of the idea of what that whole teacher support might be is, well, we need to make sure that we're offering things that will help our educators. And compassion in my mind is, it's this idea or the notion that, well, we're there, we recognize what's happened, we recognize that there's been a lot of pain and that people are suffering. What can I do to help ease that suffering? That's what compassion is, and it's very ethical, right? And so part of what our role as an administrator would be is, what actions can I take to support or to make things better? That is what compassion is. As long as they're acting in that way, then there will be acting with compassion. So, and I think that kind of speaks to the other piece as well, why things are so important. Because as we open, we have to do this in a way that's going to be beneficial to everyone.
Thank you, Dr. J. I found Stephanie's original question. What I'm trying to do here is use our time by combining questions if at all possible. So, but I will read this one specifically. She said, self-compassion is a journey with many people in different places. How do you support teachers who do not necessarily understand self-compassion and are not doing their own work with being compassionate towards themselves? So you spoke to that a bit already, but perhaps given that I just read it exactly, some other things are coming to mind.
So I have a teacher friend who just can't stand the term mindfulness, right? Or compassion. Is like, I don't buy into that hoo-hoo stuff. I can't stand it. Well, just because you don't like the term, and we don't even have to use the term, it doesn't mean that we're not doing the work, right? This right here is a completed vision of an EMTSS that was done looking through compassionate eyes. So if all you were doing was offering, for example, a training on secondary traumatic stress and trauma, or on compassion fatigue, or on racial trauma and its impact, right? It will help people work through their journey. You just don't have to call it that. Sometimes it's like, feeding my nieces and nephews broccoli, but calling it little trees that they can then, ranch. You have to do the same type of thing. So when we're talking about compassion fatigue or mental health first aid training, as you go through that work, you can talk about what it means to be kind to yourself. If you're experiencing these things, not taking it out on yourself or others, you are still engaging in compassionate work and helping people along their journey. You're just putting it in the lens of mental health first aid training, or racial trauma, or compassion fatigue, or whatever that might be. So that's how I would approach it. Any other questions?
Thank you. One of the follow-ups to something we just spoke about is, what recommendations might you have for conflict resolution training? And this pertains to the question that asked about, how do you get the administration to be on board?
Conflict resolution training in the context of people disagreeing about what's needed or what's important?
I'm going to invite Pilar to elaborate via video or chat if you'd like. That's who shared the question.
Hi. So what I meant by that is more like in promoting well-being, I think the school culture at our school feels that not supported very much by administration, and also peer-to-peers. Teachers have conflict, but there hasn't really been like resolution there. So how do we promote well-being and deal with conflict resolution, both peer-to-peer and the dynamics of administration and peer as well?
Okay. It's interesting. So conflict management training, I'm not sure right now, I'm not necessarily aware of particular trainings around that, but what I will say, I believe that our labor management team might have some particular resources to that, but what I will say is that part of compassion, right, and understanding around well-being is that there is going to be, differing views, right? There's diversity of thought. And I think the idea around having these conversations, having a space where people can share what it is that they really feel, that will be okay, so long as they are not standing in the way of others who might want to do that work. With administration, I honestly feel like in the 50 some odd days that we have left before school starts, not sure if you've had these talks recently, but things have changed, right? I think people are kind of more in a space where they are getting like, oh, this is going to be much more important than we realize. It's going to also need some strong leadership from the very top. And so if we have an administrator who may not be feeling this way, I think the teams, the labor management teams could actually be helpful here in helping to steer this direction. But I would want to talk with you more personally just to kind of get a better feel of what is actually happening, so we could like come up with some additional ideas just for you. But what I will say is that things have shifted, and in the rush to open up, teachers, you have a tremendous amount of power. If you're not getting the support that you need, the opening up is not going to be successful. And administrators, we recognize that. We need to know that. And I do think we're in a space where we can better recognize that now.
Thank you so much, Dr. J. We've reached noon, although I can see that lots of great conversation would continue to come of this. I added her email address in the chat as well as the resources link. Ashley and I will work together to make sure the other items that you all requested, including links to some upcoming webinars, are sent your way and included on the LMI Summit website. We thank you so much for joining us, and also for having patience with us as we're in this ongoing adventure of experiencing a virtual version of this. Typically we'd be in San Diego together right now. But thank you again, and thank you so much, Dr. J, for sharing your thoughts with us, your experience. There's so much more to dig into here, and I'm sure that we'll have many more conversations to come.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. J.